40,000 years ago, Australia's giant land animals died out, and now a team of scientists believe they've worked out why. The researchers argue that megafauna were wiped out by humans. This refutes the competing theory that the die-off was due to climate shift. Chris Johnson, Professor of Wildlife Conservation at the University of Tasmania, led the 16-strong team that discovered this. He spoke to Kathy Van Extel about their findings.
Until about 50,000 years ago, Australia had lots of giant marsupials, some giant birds, giant echidnas, and giant reptiles as well. And at that time, Australia was connected to New Guinea, so those animals roamed over that whole area. And they're all gone. We've now left with nothing much bigger than about 40 or 50 kilograms.
There's been a lot of dispute or scientific argument about what happened to those megafauna. What's the evidence that humans are responsible for their extinction?
This is probably actually the oldest debate in Australian science. People have been debating this since the 1850s. And the problem is, whatever happened, it happened quite a long time ago. You know, we're talking about extinctions that are probably 40,000 years ago or even earlier than that. So the evidence is quite fragmentary, and it's always been a polarised debate between the idea that it was human arrival that caused the extinction or that it was some kind of climate change, probably a progressive trend towards climates becoming more arid and fluctuating more that made those species decline gradually.
So why did your research fall to the humans being responsible?
We've pulled together some of the key pieces of evidence about when it happened, whether it happened suddenly or was spread over a long period, and whether it coincided with human arrival or some climate change. The short summary is that there's good evidence now that many of these extinctions happened soon after the arrival of people, and that is a date around about 50,000 years or a bit earlier. And there's really nothing much changing in the climate at that time that can explain the extinctions. And what's also becoming clearer is that this was a kind of a synchronised event. It wasn't the culmination of a change that had been developing over a very long period and therefore must have some kind of climatic or global explanation. It seems that many of the species that disappeared at that time had stable populations before the arrival of people, but then very soon after they declined. We can't say that about every species that went extinct because we're talking about the fossil record here, and the fossil record is very incomplete. You know, there's a lot that we don't know about a lot of species.
Have you ruled out then that it could possibly be a combination of the two, human as well as climate?
I think we have. We can't rule that out completely because the effect of one might have been quite subtle. I think what we can say is that there's no clear signal of a climate influence on the extinctions, but there's a very strong signal of a human influence.
So how did the humans kill off the animals? Was it hunting or was it large-scale burning?
Good question. It's almost certainly not large-scale burning because there's just not sufficient evidence of either an increase in fire or a change in vegetation, which is the effect that fire would have had. It's quite a remarkable thing. You know, we tend to assume that when Aboriginal people arrived in Australia, they changed the vegetation by burning. But it's actually very, very hard to find any evidence of that kind of change. It seems to be there in some places, but in many other places it's not. But the megafauna went extinct everywhere. And that kind of leaves hunting. The sticking point, or the stumbling block, I suppose, is that if you look at ancient occupation sites, like campsites or hearthstones, ancient fireplaces, from the time when people first got to Australia, we don't see big diprotodon bones with cut marks on them suggesting that they were butchered by people. But in fact, those campsites have almost no material in them apart from stone tools because they're so old. There's a problem here with loss of evidence with time that means that some of the detail about how people might have interacted with those big animals just isn't available to us.
So apart from staking a claim in this debate of human versus climate, what's the significance of this finding?
It's significant because it tends to bring Australia into line with the rest of the world where there were extinctions of large animals that coincided with human arrival, and in other places we're talking about mammoths and giant ground sloths and cave bears and things like that. These things happened a bit earlier in Australia, and Australia is a very important case in understanding the effect of the arrival of humans in an ecosystem. The other reason this is important is it tells us that there was a big ecological change that was quite sudden, that was a result of the arrival of people. And that ecological change is the loss from the landscape of lots of very big herbivores. And big herbivores are important in controlling the structure and the distribution of vegetation types. So we might have expected, as a result of the extinction of the megafauna, that the ecology of Australia changed in significant ways. And there's other evidence suggesting that that's actually true. The changes are quite variable from place to place, but we can see them.
So do you expect that this debate over human versus climate will end now?
That's a little bit hard to say. Really, over the last 10 years, most of the evidence has been pointing towards human impact. And there is sort of much less evidence, I would say, for an effect of climate. So I think probably there's a shift towards acceptance of a human role in these extinctions. But in science, none of these things are ever uncontested or quickly accepted. There will always be people who want to probe that evidence and maybe look for alternative interpretations, and that'll go on for a while, I'm sure.
Professor Chris Johnson from the University of Tasmania speaking with Kathy Van Extel.